My name's Roland Anglin. I'm the Dean of the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs, and I welcome you on behalf of the college. Now, as part of the book release, Advancing Equity Planning Now, edited by Norm Krumholtz and Kathy Hexter, we're hosting this program to continue the exploration of the future of equity planning in Cleveland. I want to thank the Cleveland Foundation for their support of this book project and their commitment to this work. Today's focus will look at housing and community development, but we'll also touch on other planning issues addressed in the book as well. We are pleased that all of you could join us for this important discussion. And now I'd like to introduce a very special person in this community and to me, India Pierce-Lee, who is Senior Vice President of Programs at the Cleveland Foundation. She leads the Foundation's grant-making team, working with the board, staff, and community leaders to define Greater Cleveland's critical needs and leverage resources. India?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's an honor to be here today. And the Cleveland Foundation is proud to have supported the effort to recognize and remind planners, developers, and those involved in renewing our cities the importance of equity planning. As the oldest community foundation rooted in serving Clevelanders, but more importantly, those living in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, supporting Norm and the contributors of this book is timely and important work aligned with the investments the foundation has made to many organizations across the city to create a more racially, economically, and equitable city. Advancing equity planning now is more important than 50 years ago. We are still asking questions and trying to find the solutions as to why we have so much inequity. Why are we still fighting redlining, poverty, abandonment, economic disinvestment? At the same time, pockets of some very select neighborhoods are growing. Through the efforts of Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, CDC's philanthropy, and many others, over the past 3 years, many have begun to have a deep and open conversation about racial equity and inclusion, and acknowledging the institutional and systemic racism that has continued to plague our communities, as well as this nation. It is opportunities like today to ensure that those embedded in this work and those that come in the future understand that without equity planning, we all lose. It is even a greater honor and blessing to recognize and to have Norm Krumholtz in our midst, who as a visionary planning director for the city of Cleveland 50 years ago, understood the social implications of planning beyond bricks and mortar and what it meant for the citizens of Greater Cleveland. Norm is a national icon, and on behalf of Ron Richard, Lillian Curry, and the entire foundation staff, we thank you for continuing to make this your life's work and continuing to teach and bring dialogue to the forefront. And again, we'd like to thank all of those who contributed to making this book a success. I close with a quote from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, India. And you really have set the stage for our discussion today. And I also want to thank the Cleveland Foundation for their support of the book throughout the entire process. So thank you. So I'm Kathy Hexter, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel today. And we're going to really have a discussion. I have some questions for each of the panelists, and then we're going to leave about a half hour at the end to take questions from the audience. So make notes if you want to. I first have to say, I want to say a little bit about the book. On a personal level, being able to work on this book with Norm Krumholtz was a great pleasure for me. So thank you, Norm. And the book is really hands-on. It does not ignore the realities of the planning profession. It recognizes that planners are always balancing equity and efficiency, who benefits and who pays, and that all planning depends in the end on being able to effectively build coalitions and navigate the political landscape. The book offers a how-to for advocating within the political system to achieve real ends, whether they're in housing, community development, transportation, land use, workforce, or many of the other areas addressed by the authors in the book. Each chapter in the book is written by a different author. We have young practitioners, we have older academics, we have people representing the federal level, local level, regional, all talking about how they have experienced weighting the scales for equity without losing sight of efficiency, which is always the planner's dilemma. Two of the authors are with us today, Pat Costigan and Mark McDermott, and we'll hear from them in a minute, along with our other two panelists and Norm. But I do want to say, before I forget, that we will have books for sale over there. They just arrived at the end of the program. And before I get to the panelists, I want to start with Norm.
Okay.
Norm is, after all, the founder of Equity Planning. And when you and your staff wrote the 1975 Policy Planning Report, it was groundbreaking. Today, we hear a lot about equity, and rightly so, given the growing inequities in our society. And I think many planners, I know a lot of you are in the audience, would say that the reason they went into planning in the first place was a commitment to social justice and a more just society. But equity is a word that has a lot of different interpretations, like sustainability. So what do you mean when you say equity planning? And why is this book so important today?
Well, equity planning is a practice of city planning, city and regional planning practitioners to advance on a day-to-day level the needs of the lowest income population of the city. In Cleveland, during the 1970s, we had a 10-year-long experiment in equity planning. And to identify that, we not only wrote the 1975 Policy Planning Report, which has been recognized, incidentally, by the American Planning Association as a landmark planning document, but we also adopted an approach to our work, our day-to-day activities, which was the slogan, "More choices for those who have few." Now, when you think about more choices for those who have few, we don't mean to imply more choices, particularly more choices for all. Those people in our society who are lucky enough to have the resources necessary to make their own choices don't need the help of planners in particular. It's the people who have fewest choices, which, if you think about it, are the poorest and lowest income people of the city. And what equity planning tries to do is to move more opportunities, more choices, more resources more political participation to those lower income groups. As I mentioned, in the 70s, a small group of planners under my direction directed ourselves toward that objective, more choices for those who have few, and produced, over a 10-year period, many useful and tangible results. We were the lead agency to establish the RTA, the Regional Transit Authority, and the terms and conditions, including better service and lower fares and point-to-point pickup and delivery service for RTA, all of which benefited the low-income transit-dependent population. We were the lead agency that changed the state law, or helped change the state law, to allow the city to take title to tax abandoned properties and set up a land bank. We were the lead agency for the city that encouraged the city to lease its lakefront parklands, which the city was unable to maintain, to the Department of Natural Resources at the state level, later on, of course, to be transferred to the Metro Park system. So there were many tangible benefits that my staff and I produced during that decade. And the book, as Kathy has indicated, is an attempt to try to interest current practitioners, current planning practitioners, and encourage them to think of their opportunity in their planning work to move opportunities, jobs, resources, political participation to those people who lack political participation. It's a long answer to a complicated question.
Okay, thank you. Pat, I'm going to turn to you now. Pat Costigan is a principal in the CF Housing Group and serves as a strategic advisor to the RAD Collaborative. And he worked for HUD during the Obama administration and played a key role in designing RAD, which is the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. So, Pat, I know that you had worked with Norm previously. How did you draw on your equity planning skills at the federal level, and how did it influence your work on designing RAD?
So I've known Norman Krumholtz, I've had the good fortune, let me just say that, for over 40 years, so you might imagine that I've been asked that question here and there along the way. Before I answer it directly, I do want to pause on something. Roland said it, India said it, Kathy said it. But we're in a time where equity, but its opposite, inequality, is really forefront. I mean, we have world economists, we have presidential candidates, we have lots of attention to equity, but I was kind of struck by India's quote by James Baldwin. Norm Krumholtz, I think, for the 40 years that I've known him, has been helping us face what can be done. And so there's a history, there's a practice, there's wonderful results, but I want to ask, how many in this room, how many of you are students here? Okay, and how many of you have worked with Norm over the years? How many of you have been influenced by Norm over the years? All right, Norman, did you see all those hands go up?
I'm really touched. Thank you.
But I think the Baldwin quote is perfect. Norm has helped us sort of face what can seem to be an overwhelming, what do we do? And Norm really launched a practice locally, regionally, and gave us really a roadmap, a set of pathways. So when I went into the federal government, Norm was curious a lot about, can any of what we, when I worked for Norm here for 5 years at the Center for Neighborhood Development, and others up here in Cleveland, Mark and Jeff and I have been involved in housing and community development for years. Can any of this be transposed to the federal arena. And he said, you know, you've been working on this RAD thing, the rental assistance demonstration. When he asked me that question, I kind of, at first blush, I thought equity planning, the real principles that Norm and others have established in the local and regional settings are very difficult to kind of put into the big machinery of the federal government. And my first inclination was, I don't think so. I think it's just too big and too bulky. But then I realized that really wasn't what he was asking me. He was asking, did you learn anything in the 40 years that I've known you? Did anybody else at HUD learn anything? Did that smart Secretary Sean Donovan and Carol Galante, the FHA Commissioner, and Sandy Enriquez, the Assistant Secretary for Public Housing, did any of them kind of bring to the federal government some notions about equity and planning and practice? And as I thought about that, the answer was yes, obviously, but not in the sense that we pursued a playbook. I mean, I did have the Cleveland Policy Planning Report inscribed in my head, and I own all of Norm's other books, as well as the current one. But I think the point, and it suggests to me is telling, is it was just kind of ingrained in Secretary Donovan and FHA Commissioner Galante and Assistant Secretary Enriquez. We just looked at this challenge of public housing that hadn't been working terribly well for years, for 30 years, and said, what can be done different? And it wasn't just around the margins. There had to be a radical, new, different approach and vision. And so I wrote a chapter in the book, and I'm prepared to talk about some of those principles as we go along here, where I actually reflected on this. What was it that we maybe intuitively, reflexively, brought to the federal government in thinking about public housing? And Jeff was always my sort of sounding board in terms of thinking about all this. And I've appreciated that and thought of Jeff as a very helpful and good friend over the years. But I'll just say a few things about this rental assistance demonstration, and there's lots of details. But your question, boiling it down, we needed a different vision. I mean, public housing wasn't working. Jeff will tell you that. I don't need to go into all the details. But when we came on the scene, Jeff and folks had been short funded by HUD nationally, about $2 billion a year. Couldn't keep up their housing stock. Kind of took the blame for it, but it was really the Congress gave up funding public housing as we knew it. That led to a tremendous backlog, capital backlog. Jeff couldn't do much with what he had to work with out of HUD, but triage his properties. And I don't mean just Jeff, I mean all the 3,100 Housing Authority fellow directors that Jeff was toiling with out there. And what triage led to was you can't keep it up, you have to eventually knock it down. And we were losing 10 to 15,000 affordable housing units a year. And that just seemed unconscionable to the secretary, to Sandy, to me. It just seemed ridiculous. Every community saying we have this desperate shortage of very low-income affordable housing, and here we're knocking down 15,000 units a year. So that was our analysis. That's another principle. Look at the data. It was hitting us in the face. And we needed a different vision. And so we Sean put forward, Secretary Donovan put forward a vision that I don't think was genius. He's thought to be a pretty smart guy. I can tell you that he is. But all we said was, we need to do something different than what we've been doing since 1937. The way that we fund public housing is inane. And it's leading to what Jeff has to deal with. And so we said, well, what if we just got public housing on the same footing, the same platform as all other forms of affordable housing? Made it work like we do with the Cleveland Housing Network, or in Boston or Chicago or Los Angeles or San Francisco. We've had a long history of that. In fact, that history had a footing here in Cleveland, and that was President Ronald Reagan knocked out all the affordable housing funding for multifamily housing. Folks here in Cleveland learned how to do it, and they began to work with Section 8 housing, low-income housing tax credits. Mark wrote a nice chapter documenting all that. So the analysis, the vision, the concept, they weren't that hard, honestly. It was kind of obvious. So we started with that. We had some notable lack of success in the early go-around and getting this off the ground and how to do that. Does anybody in the room besides Jeff know what TRA stands for, or PETRA? Not a quiz, but Brian, you can't answer that either. Terrorizing rental assistance is what it became known as, or people for the ethical treatment of rental assistance. We didn't do it right out of the box. So that's another hallmark that I learned was you don't always get it right, you have to kind of persist, and you have to kind of come back at it. And so we did, and we kind of came back at it. There was some genius that said enough of terrorizing and ethical treatment, let's just have a rental assistance demonstration. And so we began that way. We didn't do a good job with Congress or stakeholders. That's hence the names, terrorizing and the, kind of the games that were played. But we went back and we tried to pay attention. Stakeholders, bring it along. Within a year, we paid attention to what we hadn't done well, and we got it right. And we put forward a bill, worked with stakeholders, drafted the bill, and Congress was thrilled with 6 pages instead of the original concept of 57. So all of this to say is that intuitively, less by book, less by, kind of taking out a checklist, but just intuitively, and I think that says a lot, that a secretary of HUD, that an FHA commissioner, that an assistant secretary, that people like Jeff would all just sort of say, no, we need to do something different, and we have to kind of come up with an equity approach, because who of all people in our country suffer more equity, fewer choices, if any choices, about where they live and what they really have as options in life. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, we'll come back to some of this in a little bit. But so Pat goes through all of this in his chapter, but he's touching on themes that run through the book. And so look at the data, right? These are all principles of equity planning. Look at the data, persist. If your idea doesn't fly, recast it. Build new coalitions. Find new stakeholders. Every chapter in the book talks about these tools from a different perspective. So I love that you worked so closely with Jeff, and I'm sure other housing authority directors. So I want to turn to you, Jeff. Jeffrey Patterson is the CEO and Safety Director of CMHA here in Cleveland, the Housing Authority. And under his leadership, CMHA has made huge strides in improving the quality of public housing and helping voucher holders move to areas of greater opportunity. You've really transformed the organization. And it's been my pleasure to be able to work with you a little bit on some of that. But I know that you have a video that you want to show us about public housing and RAD, is it?
Well, I guess what I want to do, and first, thank you for the kind words, and I think that before I get into what I'm going to say, I think that the hard work and the reformative housing authority started with our leadership. Our chairman is here today, Mr. Robert Davis, along with our vice chairman, Stephanie Pope, and I think I saw Dr. Ronnie Dunn, who was also a chairman of our board here as well, and our leadership team. And I think that aside from those individuals, I think a change in the philosophy from the Housing Authority of being willing to reach out and work with various community partners has helped us out a great deal. Going into some of the things, and the video that I have is more of a photo essay. So what I'm going to encourage people to do is to go to our website, cmha.net, and this photo essay talks about our first RAD project, which was Bone Tower. Bone Tower is a 22-story, 267 unit high-rise located in downtown Cleveland. And what we were able to do with this particular project was something that I think was very exciting. We would not have been able to do it had it not been for the RAD program. We don't get a lot of just here's money, go do X, Y, and Z. A lot of the different things now we have to do more applying for, we have to do more tax credits. It's not just one sole basic source of funding. It's a culmination, a combination of different types of funding. And with that Bone Tower project, it was more than just, let's just go in and change the housing. It was also, let's talk to the folks about what's being done in that housing. Let's talk to the residents about, we're painting the walls. What would you like to see? Hey, we'd like to see some accent walls. Why does everything have to look the same? Why does everything have to be institutional? Let's talk about how we could put things on the walls to indicate what floor it is in different areas. Let's talk about how we could create a community area that is truly a community area, an area where people could come and gather and fellowship, especially with Bone Tower being a senior facility. So when I take a step back and I remember, some of the early conversations about RAD, CMHA was one of the first housing authorities to step up and get into the game. And we took a lot of stuff for it too, because it wasn't something that a lot of people were doing. There had been, a lot of different challenges, but we had a lot of support. Our local HUD office, and Pam Ashby is here from HUD with us, and they've been a tremendous partner in supporting us as we went forward in this endeavor. We decided to go with, took 3 bites of the apple, and we took 3 different types of bites. We went with our Bone Tower, which was our senior high-rise, which was going to entail rehabilitating that building. But more importantly, Bone Tower is a 22-story building with 2 old elevators. Those elevators do not always work because it's been there for a long time, required a lot of maintenance. Through this project, we were able to build and develop a new elevator in that facility, a new 3rd elevator for a 22-story building. That alone, for a resident, for a senior, and the experience that they have, made a significant difference. We then were able to work to start to move forward on an effort that we had in the central community under at our Cedar Estates. And we were able to develop a phase of housing called Sankofa Village. Sankofa meaning you have to reach back and able to move forward. And that site was a new development. And we were able to move forward with that as well. And then Heritage View Homes, which is the old Garden Valley, we were able to get a 4th phase of Garden Valley, again, through the rental demonstration project. Now, during this time, there were a few choice neighborhood grants that were awarded across the country. But over the past, I want to say maybe 5 years, there may have been somewhere between 12 to 15 different grant opportunities that have been provided, but there have been hundreds of applications that have been put in. So there's not going to be enough funding to be able to move forward with the different types of developments that are there. So when we got this opportunity for the rental demonstration project, it was a good opportunity for us. That's what we wanted to do. And I think the connectivity between the residents, talking with them about what was important to them, and also making our communities not just be so isolated. I think one of the biggest criticisms that I think public housing has had in the past is that the folks are isolated in 2 tracks. One, some say the folks are isolated because they want to be. Others say they're isolated because they're not being introduced into the fabric of a community. And in Bone Tower, that's something that we're working on as if you're a Bone Tower resident and you're sitting downtown and you see the multiple projects that are going on in that area, how does it make you feel when your development where you're living is not being touched? But then turn around and say, how do you feel when everybody else is fixing up their yard and your yard is being fixed up too? And as these new opportunities and these new partnerships come together, you get a chance to see what's going on and to be a part of that and to take advantage of all the things that the city of Cleveland has to offer. So that is our goal, to be able to use this program to reintroduce ourselves and reconnect ourselves to the community, not just solely as public housing residents, but truly as residents and participants within the greater Cleveland community.
Okay. Do we want to show the video?
I can flip through some slides for you if you like. Me stepping down here is merely for effect. Little comic relief. So this photo essay, turn it on here. It talks about, what's going on at the site. It talks about the fact that this rental assisted demonstration program was a program from HUD. And this essay was put together to kind of describe the resident experience. As I mentioned, Bone Tower is a 22-story high-rise in downtown. The affordable housing property is not only surrounded by condominiums, multifamily housing, and high-rise office buildings, but it sits very close to the waterfront and the queue. And again, I say to you, if someone were to look at this and see the opportunity that's there, they would say, why should an affordable housing development sit right there? Wouldn't this just be a great place for us to put other housing, but not allow those within the affordable housing community to have the same type of benefits and the same type of opportunities that others have in this community? So we talked about how our team sat down, met with several of the tenants, who all agreed that this was the best location in the city. They realized that this is a good prime piece of real estate and a good place to be. We took on these renovations and it was tough. Due to some of the challenges and the timelines and things like that, we weren't able to say, okay, let's just take everybody out of the building and move. So we had to have a very strategic approach in terms of being able to vacate some floors, be able to start some construction, complete some construction in some areas, and to be able to move residents up to the completed areas, and then just kind of work our way through the building that way. That occurred for almost an 18-month to 2-year period. And during that time, that caused a significant, inconvenience for the residents. But to their credit, the residents were able, in most cases, to see further down the road and to be able to understand that at the end of the day, this inconvenience, while being inconvenience, would also lead to improvement for them. We also were able to provide residents with job opportunities working as a part of this project. So there were residents that were given a task of logging things. There were residents that were given a task of being involved, being able to do some light maintenance work. And all of a sudden, it went from being a project of somebody else doing something for me to being a project that someone could say, hey, I'm doing something as a part of bettering my home, bettering my community. And as you can see, with some of the faces in the residents and things like that, they were very, excited about having that opportunity. This picture right here is of a gentleman. His name is Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown is one of our resident leaders at the Bone Tower. He doubles as a resident leader, security officer, security guard, party coordinator, whatever you need, Mr. Brown does. But when we talked about this, and sometimes a picture can really capture, what someone is saying, you look at his seriousness of his face, and you look at how he's expressing himself. He's not expressing himself as someone that this is what somebody said for me to do or someone asked me to do. If you look at his face, he's speaking in a way where he said, this is how I feel, and this is my project too. This is not just CMHA's project, this is my project as well. And I think he has this quote there, and hopefully you can see some of it, but he was instrumental in also being able to communicate to the other residents what was going on and making sure that everyone understood the end game. So we did, a lot of work there. We did some kitchens, we did some bathrooms, we did some renovation of some floors. We were able to put in some equipment. As I mentioned, we did the community room and made that a lot better. And another resident leader, Mr. Taller Williams, said it changes people's concept of Housing Authority. It's not a project, he said, smiling. He's lived at Bone Tower for 6 years and served as the president of the Tower's Advisory Council. So he's saying that it's not a project in two ways. One, that it's not just about the bricks and mortar, but more importantly, he's also saying that traditional public housing has been called projects and was filled with all kinds of stereotypes that relate to that word. And he's saying that the work that's being done there that he's a part of is not a project in that sense of the word project. You know, when we move folks into those units, for a lot of people, it was a tremendous experience for them. They had never been into new housing. So for them to go in, to see this renovation, to see some of these things that have been done, albeit may not necessarily be perfect, but it was something that was a lot different, and it gave you a little bit different feel for what's going on. You know, that they came to me and said, Mr. Patterson, CMHA put in a non-smoking initiative last year based on a mandate from HUD. And there were a lot of places where I had a lot of issues with people wanting to comply with that order. Bone Tower was the one place, probably in part because of Mr. Brown, that I didn't have that problem. Because for them, they had something new, they had something exciting, and they didn't want anything or anyone loitering or cluttering up in front of their building. If you drive down Bone Tower most days, what you see is people coming in and out, being dropped off, but you don't see large congregations of people just sitting in front of Bone Tower. That's not a management-driven thing. I don't, have Chief Gonzalez and the police out there every day moving people along. Those are residents who have made the decision themselves to say, this is how we want our building to be. And when it goes that way, that makes it a lot better. And then finally, I want to say that, there are several things that we want to make sure if you're going to have this RAD program. You have to make sure you all understand all of the work that's going on. So if you're going to be doing all of this work, you're going to be doing all this construction, everybody's got to know what's going on and how that's going to affect you. You got to examine any possible unforeseen circumstances. So you got to sit down and really talk and make sure you understand that, okay, something can happen, but if something happens, folks aren't sitting around pointing the finger about blame. Folks is more in turn trying to figure out how they could work together to overcome it. You have to coordinate your relocation timeline with the construction contractor's timeline. So, a part of this is that you're moving people from left to right. And I know that when you look at the bottom line, you say, okay, well, you're moving into a new unit or a better unit, it's all good. You're disrupting somebody's life for a period of time. And even at the end of the day, you may believe that something's going to be better. You still have to make sure that you take that into account and that you're working with the contractor to make sure that you can adhere to that date. Be available and have a lot of face time with your tenants. At these projects, it's not a thing where I'm just coming around. I come down, I want to know what's going on, and I want the people to have the opportunity to tell me what's going on, and I want to see for myself what's going on. And there are little things and little fires that could be put out with that type of interaction. Altogether, communication is the most important thing. And finally, when you're developing these types of projects, you have to listen to the residents when developing the scope. Now, that doesn't mean that you just take everything and you just, put everything in and you're able to do this based on costs and things. You won't be able to do that. But something as small as an accent wall could be the thing that takes someone from having a so-so perception of it to be able to tell their daughter or their son, wow, look at this. I always wanted to have this. This is nice. And it gives something to be able to give you some input into personalizing your own unit. The same way any of us that we buy a home, the home may be nice when you buy it. But the first thing you want to do, the first opportunity you get after you put a little bit more money in your pocket, is to personalize your home to yourself, to do the things that you want. It's no different with our residents. If we're able to have those opportunities, we can do that. So this was our first development, which was a renovation. We've done 2 more with Heritage View and with Old Cedar, Sankofa Village. We currently, right now, are renovating Carver Park, and we've done 2 phases of Carver Park. And just yesterday, we closed on our development for Riverside Park. And so we're going to be improving 204 units out at Riverside Park, where it's again a nice development. It's out near the airport. And our preference and our challenge as we move forward is to make sure that we do a balance of housing development across the city, because we are a housing authority that stretches across the county. So I may have gone a little longer than you wanted, Kathy. I'm sorry. That just means I get 2 less questions to answer. But I wanted to make sure that I at least gave everybody opportunity to hear some of the things we're doing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hope I don't fall.
Okay, now we're going to shift the focus a little bit to community development, our last 2 panelists. Mark McDermott probably needs no introduction, but he is the Vice President and Market Leader of Enterprise Community Partners. And Mark, you also worked with Norm for several years and kind of, I would say, grew up with the community development industry in Cleveland. So how did your experience working with Norm and your base in equity planning inform your work at Enterprise, where you're really working at the national, regional, and local levels, so all 3 levels of government? And then could you talk a little bit about all the things that Enterprise is doing to contribute to equity planning today? Like what's on your plate?
That's like 3 questions.
I know.
You can handle them.
And in terms of growing up with Norm, actually one of my office mates told me that I was acting like a 14-year-old today. So obviously I didn't do as much growing up as I could. You know, I should say both personally and on behalf of the community, again, as Patrick did, thank you to Norm. So many folks here realize what Norm contributed to the community here, the entire community, and a lot of folks don't, and the influence that's had. But it's been really tremendous. I was a low-paid community organizer getting burnout when and knew Patrick, and when Pat and Norm approached me about coming to work at the Center for Neighborhood Development, where a number of folks here, hi Bill, and others had worked, and it was just one of the best jobs I ever had, because Norm was such a inspirational leader, and he also just said, I'd come to him, I'd say, you know, well, look, they're not, you know, the city's not doing that right over there. Can't we go work with those community groups and do something? He'd say, yeah, sure, go ahead. Just don't get me in trouble with the bosses, you know, right? So it was just fantastic environment at the time to be doing, to be really helping build a community development industry and organization, set of organizations here in town, and a real blessing. So thank you. I'm not going to say thank you for inviting me to write a chapter of the book, because that was ridiculous. You know, I don't write anything. Right? I could, if we have to write something, I'm like, Kathy, you can write this, right? Just let me edit it, right? And I look at it, and that was hard work. But it was, Pat and I were talking a little bit, it was really, actually, it was fantastic, because what Norm said is just, Mark, just write about, you know, your history and the history of community development here in town. And that was a blast, actually. So doing that, and it's not the best written chapter. They're good editors. That's the good part about it.
Good editors, yeah.
But it's really a great book. It's really an accessible and I think a really relevant book in terms of where equity planning and the principles of equity planning, because I'm no planner, really apply to our work today. And if I could touch on, in response to your actual question, Kathy, two areas. One is there's two, I call a couple lessons learned in the chapter, but two lessons learned especially that I'd like to call out that make the transference from equity planning per se over to what we're actually doing in the community, right? What we're doing, Ricardo, what we're doing, in the Clark Fulton community, and Jenny and Church Shoreway, and everybody else in the crowd here, what we're doing at CMHA, and one of those is that policy always is the factor where you can influence the most change. And that planning really underlies that policy, but that policy comes about through some type of community organizing, and that could be really grassroots community organizing. It could be tenants within CMHA. It could be this county stakeholders group that we have together, that a number of us in the room have worked on, that are more at the community, the organizational level. But without that kind of organizing, we don't see a hell of a lot of really effective policy change. And that gets funded by our funders, thankfully, and it happens hand in hand with our public sector partners. But we have to keep in mind that's the kind of work that has to happen in order to bring about change. On our county housing stakeholders group, we spent 4 years, right? And we had a good time together, coming together once a month, but we spent 4 years coming together. That resulted finally in the Cuyahoga County having its first ever comprehensive housing plan, right? Never before had done that, which has since resulted in, other than demolition, the county's first investment of its own dollars into housing development for our norm, those who have the least choice, right? And that was 4 years of work of us just slagging it out and not giving up. And so I think that's one lesson that I really want to pull out of this, and what we do at Enterprise, because we're Jeff's equity. The first 3 RAD deals, that Jeff mentioned, including Bone Tower. We're his equity and debt partners on those buildings, and we're proud to be his equity and debt partners on those buildings. It's part of what we do, and we're always going to do that. But I think the most important work we do is in the community, really building up that kind of ability to take on policy issues and community issues as coalitions. And the second the second most important lesson I think that I've seen over the years, and that's really again tying back to equity planning principles, is that in addition to policy, it's about money, right? Ain't it always? It's about money, and it's about what kind of money is flowing, to whom, and how's it flowing. And sometimes it's not even so important as how much to start with, right? But it's about who's it flowing to and how's it getting there. So in our environment where, and this is what RAD was, right? At the federal level, we're not seeing it, right? I mean, hopefully we always got to keep hope, right? That one day that's going to change, but we're just not seeing it. And RAD was a solution to bring in, private equity dollars, local dollars, state dollars, in addition to national dollars, as a solution to decades of disinvestment in public housing. And it's made a huge difference, as Jeff showed. But it's also about how we continue to work with our public sector partners around coming up with new local dollars in conjunction with philanthropic dollars, in conjunction with corporate dollars, et cetera, but how we just can't give up on the money side. Because we can have all the great policies we want, and if we don't have the dollars to make these kind of deals, these kind of projects, not projects, but great places to live for residents, that's not going to happen. You know, when we see that low-income housing tax credit allocations are oversubscribed 4 to 5 to 1, right? That we could double tax credit allocations nationally and still be, you know, only serving half of what we could do. That's about the money. And so our plan's always got to focus on money, and it's always got to focus on public and private money coming together, but the public money's got to be there. This sounds like a perfect time to hand it over to Director Maness. Can I touch on one other issue we're working on locally, and it's in conjunction with CMHA and others, and it's something called source of income discrimination, right? And that is that if you go on Craigslist, right, and look for a rental unit, not only will you see many landlords saying no Section 8, like verbatim in their rental description, right? Not only will you see them saying that, but it's perfectly legal. Right? The Fair Housing Center here in town did a study year and a half ago, and the premise of the study was looking at whether no Section 8 and that discrimination against folks who had a voucher was in fact a proxy for race. So it was in fact a de facto racist practice in our community, and the data showed without a doubt that that was the case. Right? So we're working right now hand in hand with the Fair Housing Center and CMHA and the city and a bunch of other nonprofit partners to get the county to adopt source of income anti-discrimination. You know, last year, the county, to their credit, adopted anti-discrimination based upon sexual orientation, gender identity, right? So that was fantastic. And the next phase, right, is to really enable all of our citizens, right, to have the opportunity to live wherever they want to damn live in the county, and in fact have that choice no matter what their source of income is. So that's another policy that is an equity policy. I don't see any of our county friends here from county council, but we're meeting with each and every one of them between now and the end of the year, and we're hoping that by the end of the year we're going to have that legislation introduced, soon to be passed. So that's the kind of stuff that's really important for us to keep working on.
Yeah. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the county adopting this housing plan. And even if you think the funding is not sufficient, it's something, and it's a starting point, and it's more than we've had before. So that was a huge accomplishment. But I think you're absolutely right that the policy has to be accompanied by the funding. And it's sort of a nice segue to
Can I correct the record? Because I don't want any county council people thinking that I said that the funding was not sufficient.
I said
I do agree that it was a good start. Thank you. Go ahead, Jeff.
So,
It's too late, it's on Twitter.
so Tanya. Yes. Tanya Maness is the Director of Community Development for the City of Cleveland. And you did not work with Norm, but you were a student in the college. So anyway, I want to, your department has broad responsibility for a range of activities that touch people's lives every day, not just housing, community development, transportation, jobs, all of the things that CDCs work on, neighborhood revitalization, commercial revitalization. I know that you're thinking about the money, and you're thinking about it very strategically. Could you talk a little bit about how equity planning is playing into the city's plans for community development, and where you see some opportunities to embed more equity into the city's community development work?
Sure. So I think that actually the fact that really in everything that community development and then my peers in economic development, planning and building and housing, everything we do really is embedded in the principles of equity planning. And so I would say that's success in many ways, Norm, because so many of us have come through the college, but we have a lot of people who wouldn't really identify it as such, but it's how we all think and work. And so I think in some ways that's the greatest testimony of your career and your work, because we're all doing it, and I think a lot of us don't even know or wouldn't quite, we don't necessarily always know the history behind it, so the book really does a great job of sharing that. So yes, we are chartered every day with looking at the best use of the federal housing and urban development funds coming into the city, and I could talk for a long time about that, but I'd like to just focus on a few ways that I think we really see the goal of trying to ensure that we are moving forward with mixed income, healthy neighborhoods where we are not concentrating the affordable housing in certain parts of our city, which we know is the case today. I think one of the best ways that that happens, and I see Rob Curry from CHN here today and many others who have really worked hard on the scattered site. Oh, I'm sorry, looking right at you, Kate. The scattered site mixed income housing, where instead of, again, the importance of having CMHA housing, concentrated housing, but also scattering housing throughout our neighborhoods so people don't feel stigmatized. I think one of the best comments that the mayor made was that when he was driving through Slavic Village, he couldn't tell the difference between the low-income housing tax credit housing and the market rate housing that was coming up in the neighborhood. So, that's just a really good example of where Cleveland's really the only one who's using OFA's dollars to do scattered site housing. We really in everything that we do, so the community development manages the land bank. We have 15,000 properties in the land bank, and when we're looking at the disposition of those properties, we're always looking at, are the properties close to transit? Is the development really looking at, again, integrating our neighborhoods versus having those who have the least choices focused in one area? A project that right now is happening in the Fairfax neighborhood is McCormick Barron has put it forward with Fairfax, and it would be the first low-income housing tax credit development where there is market rate housing intermixed with low-income housing. The first one of scale that's gone down to OFA. So we're starting to see the sense that within our neighborhoods we can not have that concentrated low-income housing, but start to look at providing the same opportunities across the city. But then there are two specific projects I wanted to talk about. The first is the Mayor's Neighborhood Transformation Initiative, and that was really grounded in the idea that the city would focus resources in neighborhoods that were adjacent to areas that had seen great revitalization, where there were really strong assets, but those neighborhoods weren't seeing the type of benefit that they should see. So Circle North in Glenville, Clark Fulton on the near west side, Ricardo's here from Clark Fulton, and the Buckeye neighborhood. And all of those projects were really focused on the idea that we were going to work with residents to understand why they didn't have the tools necessary to build wealth in their neighborhoods. And we know that the two ways that we build wealth in our neighborhoods is typically by owning a home or starting a business. And what could we do to, and the principles of the Mayor's Neighborhood Transformation Initiative were equity, health, and wealth building in our neighborhoods. So, everything, when we look at are we doing the right things in these neighborhoods, is are we building on those three premises? And the second project that kind of builds off of that is currently the opportunity that OFA has given the city of Cleveland to choose a neighborhood where we could invest $3 million of low-income housing tax credits over a 3-year period. And the criteria, and I think this was really smart of OFA, required that there were market rate units being built with the low-income housing tax credit units, that there was a strong community partner that wasn't just looking at low-income housing, that you're looking at what are the other benefits to the neighborhood. You're really building a neighborhood, you're building a community, you're not just looking at building low-income housing. And that it was an area where in the community we were quickly losing affordable housing. And I think that's, it's an exciting place in some ways for Cleveland to see areas that the market is really taking over to that extent. But the need to ensure that we're keeping affordable housing in those neighborhoods. So we went through a process where 7 neighborhoods applied to be the target area, and all of them demonstrated some of those aspects. And looking at the fact that Clark Fulton put forward a really exciting projects, but really looked at partnering with Metro Health, providing the broader community assets and the ability to rehabilitate older buildings and the core commercial districts that normally wouldn't score well for OFA. But those are just, I think, some really tangible things that we are doing in the community, but that we're able to do with the support of federal funds and our community partners.
And the city is putting some additional funding in as well.
Oh, yes, I should probably mention that. The city, and I think that's actually a really important piece of this. So the city has $25 million that is going into the Mayor's Neighborhood Transformation Initiative. And most importantly, and kind of following that money, it's leveraging another $45 million from banking partners. And if I could just mention one other thing there, I think that's a mantra and a real focus of our department that we haven't had as much in the past, where while the federal dollars are incredibly important, $30 million annually is not going to do what we need to do in our neighborhoods. And so we're very focused on strengthening our southeast side community development corporations, providing them with the resources they need, and then really encouraging our banking partners to lend on the east side of Cleveland in a way that we just really are not seeing. If we don't bring those private dollars, and I think the Mayor's Neighborhood Transformation Initiative was a really good way to start that, but it's really, again, CHN Housing Capital that's starting to be stood up as a CDFI. That's really the way for us to start lending in our neighborhoods and getting our financial partners to find the right vehicle to do that lending. Sorry, that was my last thing.
Great. Great, thank you. Do any of the panelists have questions for the other panelists? I don't want to just make this all about.
Well, I certainly do, and I have a last question for Norm. It doesn't have to be the exact last one, Kathy. I think that's yours, but a few things, maybe for each of you, but I don't want to take the whole time. But Jeff, I do want to kind of come back to you, because we talked a lot about this as we were trying to figure this out, and I think you figured out who had the easy job and who had the hard job with this RAD business. But Jeff and I talked a lot on the phone, and so the purpose of RAD was to, with the same amount of money, Mark, we kind of made it into other money, was to create better housing and more choices about that housing for folks that really had none. And I'm just delighted by that accent wall example. I never would have thought that a choice. My wife's been bugging me about an accent wall, and I think I'm going to have to go home and paint it for her this weekend. But more seriously, on one level, RAD, by objective measures, we've injected $7 billion where there was $2 billion a year, basically. That's an incredible amount of public and private sector leverage. Tanya, housing commissions have done a lot of help and good things with land and entitlements and all those important things that you do, so kudos to you. And there have been good results. I mean, 110,000 units have been closed. We see new units, we see better units. We actually see a lot of residents with stories like Jeff shared about people just really happy with, we have better housing, thank you. And they certainly should. There were two things that the secretary was bound and determined to work into this whole thing, and one I kind of quietly slipped in. And I just want to ask you about if you see any potential here in Cleveland. And the first one was this whole notion of, all right, it's great, you live in public housing, now you're going to live in rad housing, but there's going to be a choice. If you don't like it, if we don't like CMHA management, we can ask for a voucher, and you do kind of come to the top of the line after a limited tenure. And there are reasons for 1 year and 2 years and what we had to negotiate. But basically, public housing residents who really have been trapped in public housing, I mean, think about this. Who lives in public housing? Jeff kind of hinted at it, but you know, 62% are elderly, disabled, and the rest are working poor. Okay, so where do you, have a lot of choice beyond if you got into public housing, you may be lucky. You could stand in line for a voucher. You have thousands of people probably waiting for housing choice. Point being, there's not a lot of choice there, but the secretary was bound and determined to build in this choice mobility option that after the housing was converted and residents had a chance to have a look-see and see what they think of it, would be an option. And I know it's premature, but I want to ask that question. And then the kind of follow-on question is this notion that we slipped in there was what we call the transfer of assistance notion. And that is simple theory. You could just take the money at a development that's cheek by jowl on a railroad track or a garbage dump where people ought not to be living, take that amount of money and pick it up and put it somewhere else. And maybe today's parlance, we call those neighborhoods of opportunity, take the same amount of money, go somewhere else, do good things, maybe do McCormick Barron, mixed in, who knows? Maybe you're doing that job. So I just kind of curious, those were real thought out ways to offer more choices to public housing residents. You see that materializing now or in the future in the practice?
Well, I see it materializing in a couple of different ways. And, Mark, those Tuesday meetings that Mark was kind of talking about earlier, a part of that has been that we are really beginning to look to focus on developing a very good concrete mobility program, housing mobility program for Cleveland, which would allow, as Director Manise talked about, we are not trying to just rebuild housing where it is in the same numbers. We also want to work to deconcentrate some of that housing and be able to spread housing out more, create more diverse housing opportunities across the city and the county. So the RAD program builds in the infrastructure for us to be able to do that. And we're working through that process now to make the connections. Some of the things that Mark talked about with the source of income and some of those other things are things that would be significantly helpful to aid in that cause. But also, it's also trying to find and make sure that the program is ready to be able to work constructively with those different landlords and communities to make sure that we're doing it and it's going to be in the best interest of the tenants as well as the folks of those different communities. So that's one way of doing it, and that's one that we're working towards. And HUD is going to be releasing a NOFA probably a little more towards the summer for a housing mobility pilot, and that's something that we are really going to be looking to try to move forward, and we would ask for our partners and different folks in the community to support us in that effort, because I think putting together a strong application is going to take us having a strong community showing a willingness to support that type of program. The second part where you talk about transfer of assistance. So transfer of assistance deals with if you have 500 units on a site and your goal is not to build 500 units back on that site. You may build 300 units back on that site and then sprinkle the other 200 units out in other areas in the community. Maybe there's an apartment complex that's being built that's a 100-unit complex that maybe they would be willing to work with us to provide 25 project-based vouchers to provide low-income residents with the opportunity to be able to live in that building, still not concentrating poverty, but actually spreading that out. CMHA, similar to CHN, we have scattered site housing across the county as well. We have scattered site housing across the west side and parts of the east side. So we've done some of that, but I think that this is a different effort because it's more expansive. And it's our attempt to move out into what we call well-resourced communities, where there are communities that may have some additional resources, some different things. And it's not just taking someone, giving them a voucher and saying, here, go find a house. It's also trying to work to provide people with wraparound services, supportive services, to help them be able to integrate and be able to come into the various communities. I think one of the challenges with the voucher program now is that you just say, here's the voucher, but you don't do anything to work with people about the community norms. You don't do anything to work with people about, making sure that the community that they're going into is actually the best community for them. While you want to be able to, it is the individual's choice to go where they want to go, and you want to emphasize that choice, you want to also make sure that you're working to provide people with enough information for them to be able to make the best decision that they have. And for some folks, you don't have a large lens when you're walking in the door. So your perspective may be that I got this voucher and here are the only areas that I can go into. But when you have a mobility program with the type of mobility training and mobility awareness, you can then let people know about other areas and other opportunities that may suit their need. Maybe there is a child that you have that has special needs, and maybe there's a school in a certain area that may be able to accommodate those needs of that child. And you having this voucher may be able to make your family situation a lot better. So those are the types of things that I think that the RAD program, through its mobility option, but also through its transfer assistance option, where you can be able to, again, work to deconcentrate poverty is I think, very important.
I think you're touching on actually a question that I wanted to ask all of the panelists, and that is, there's a couple of chapters in the book that talk about equity planning on a regional scale, and what I think you're speaking directly to that point, that the region is really where the opportunities for greater equity lie, or many of them lie. And I don't know, Norm, do you want to comment on that, or any of the other panelists?
Well, there's no doubt but that in the area of low-income housing, the region is the location of greatest choice and opportunity. At the same time, the region is typically, I don't know whether this is still true, but it was certainly true during the period of time that I was planning director in the 70s, the region is resistant to widespread introduction of low-income housing. My staff and I prepared a proposal in 1970, which we called a fair share plan for low-income housing in Cuyahoga County. And our intent was to simply discuss. We realized that we didn't have the possibility or power to do anything, but the opportunity to discuss with all the mayors and managers and so on of the 58 communities in Cuyahoga County the possibility of introducing low-income housing as part of their housing stock. The matter was discussed with the Planning Commission on Friday afternoon, got into Saturday's plain dealer. I got a death threat immediately, and then a lot of derision from the mayors and managers and so on in Cuyahoga County. And nobody spent any time at all or made any effort to discuss the possibilities of such an outcome. However modified, however CMHA at that time could have assisted in such a program, there was no interest at all in discussing. The problem still remains that CMHA houses almost all the very low-income families in Cuyahoga County. not all, but almost all. And the question of concentration is there, with impacts on the opportunity for jobs, the opportunity for newer environments, the opportunity for perhaps a better educational system that is out there waiting to be tapped into. And the challenge, of course, remains today essentially the challenge it was in 1970. How to do it, how to discuss doing it. Perhaps the county housing plan is the way in. At least it offers an opportunity to open up that discussion, but clearly the region is where the solution lies.
Tanya, did you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to mention two things. I think part of it is changing hearts and minds in a way that it's an education, that understanding of what is affordable housing, what does that mean? When you talked about mobility services as you help to integrate people into a new community, into a new neighborhood, you hear low-income housing and people have a very clear view of what that means. And when you really start to understand what that price point is, what, you know, I think Director Collier always says that, you know, there are so many people who don't understand that they're really just one paycheck from needing affordable housing support. So I think there's something to that as well, as there is a lack of understanding of what affordable housing really means. At a metro level, I do think that there are a couple things that we're doing. I think the larger county regional view is a very difficult one to crack. One of the things that we're doing with the support of Enterprise Community Partners and with Cleveland Neighborhood Progress is having a discussion about equitable community development. Our city council is really engaged, and we're really looking at first the tax policy in the city of Cleveland, and whether it really makes sense now, 16 years later, where there is a lot of investment in Cleveland, do we really have the tax policy in place that would incentivize development across the city at multiple price points, where right now it's not necessarily benefiting anybody, frankly, that's sort of the one-size-fits-all view. And then do we have a tax policy that protects long-term residents as valuations go up? Again, a wonderful problem to have, but not a wonderful problem to have if you're on a fixed income, you own your home, and now suddenly your taxes are more than your Social Security. So, I mean, looking at that from a metro perspective, I think it could be a model to be looked at beyond the city of Cleveland, that if we are finding ways to encourage new development of housing, rehabilitation of housing through our tax policy, that brings people into neighborhoods, building and doing rehab where they wouldn't have before because the tax policy encourages it. And again, there's been a lot of leadership from our nonprofit partners and from council, and we're really excited to see that moving forward. A kind of similar notion that is at least kind of being looked at more in the first suburbs as well as in the city of Cleveland is a focus on what are really our stable neighborhoods. There's a Middle Neighborhoods initiative that was really started again with the Fed and Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, Jeff Respy from Old Brooklyn Development Corporation, and based on a book written by Paul Brophy that's really looking at our very stable neighborhoods. And those are neighborhoods that really border Cleveland as well as in Cleveland. And I think that's a place that there's common issues and a common interest in understanding everything from marketing and building a sense of community in those neighborhoods to, again, not having the lending tools that we need to do repair and rehab, to really understanding how to change the view of the real estate community and how our homes are appraised. And that's an effort that, again, is for suburbs in Cleveland, and I think maybe could be something that's looked at more broadly regionally.
Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's, you know, it's about race, right? And that's what Norm was saying. We can do all. I'm not disagreeing with you, Director. I'm not, seriously, because education about what are we talking about when we say affordable housing is really important, right? And there's a lot of ignorance about that. But it's you know, it's clearly about race, and you know, we have 59 jurisdictions, I think, in Cuyahoga County, if I remember that number correctly.
56, 59.
And you know, we look at what's happened on the kind of the, you know, the first suburbs, which have turned majority, you know, for kind of the swath on the east side, going south even, majority black now. You know, folks moved out of Cleveland back in the 70s, and when busing came in, and for every other reason. I think what's important, I think one of the things that we can show, honestly, is how in Cleveland we have neighborhoods and communities that are not only inclusive, but embracing everybody in the community. And you know, I live in Detroit Shoreway. I've lived there. Bobby and I have lived there for 30 years. Our kids can't even afford a house in the neighborhood anymore. Honestly, seriously. But it's still a very diverse neighborhood. And so, how do we show that, in fact, you know, not just a tagline that diversity is really a strength, but that every neighbor is treasured and offers a really important part of what it is to be community in Detroit Shoreway, and to hold that up, and people, you know, people's minds and hearts are changed because they see that, in fact, despite I need to be really political here, but despite the rise of what is allowed to be said in our country, right? That we in fact are a country and a city and a community, set of communities that really embrace everyone and hold up the potential for everyone. Say Yes to Education is India, I think I had to leave, but Say Yes to Education is an amazing, right, initiative that does that because it offers another tool for young people in our community to be able to have vision and hope and a path forward that's only going to enrich our community in the long run. And that's what we need to be doing. And I'm not going to worry about folks that live elsewhere in the county. You know, I'm going to worry about my community and the work that I do in our city, and with the folks and with the jurisdictions in the county that want to be working with us, and amen to that. That's what I say.
But, you know, I just want to mention, and again, this is just an effort that I just read about, and this is where you start to see the movement of jobs and the need for transportation issues, is Lake Tran starting a service that's directly from downtown Cleveland and having it be a manageable way to get to a job in Mentor, right? Where it hasn't been before, and what you really, because frankly, again, from a regional economy perspective, you're not going to see people begin to really improve their lot in life until they can access jobs that, unfortunately, with the way things have happened in this community, have really gone further and further out. So, I mean, that's a very small thing, but that can be incredibly impactful, because somebody can live in Cleveland and have a 45-minute, pretty much almost direct bus trip to a good job that before would have taken, you know, an hour and 45 minutes. So there are things we can do to connect that don't deal with the housing issue clearly, but then give people the financial ability to make choices and do what they want to do, and hopefully invest in their children's education also. I have to try to be positive.
I don't want the three of you to leave out some things that you do probably in Gray now that I think are very important. I have a different lens. Washington, D.C., we don't care who lives by who. You know, if you can afford it and it can be built well. A couple of things. I have seen good planning and good design, good architecture make a big difference in what the mayor said, indistinguishable housing. That makes a big difference. I've seen good management. CMHA, I think, does a pretty good job, and I'm sure Jeff always wants to do better. But there are private partners that have stepped in and been helpful here and there. I think good management of housing can make a big difference and alleviate some of this. And the third thing is, maybe it's a little hopeful note that we all get from Norm, is let's not underestimate the ability of some of the younger people that are coming up who like Mark's kids, frankly, don't have the income, and they're going to be pioneers, and they care probably less, maybe, than the generation or two that were in front of them about where they live or who lives next door. As long as the housing is a good value, great if it's nicely designed, it's got to be well managed. All those things matter. So I think the three of you, I just want to kind of underscore that from afar. I think those are really important factors in what you're struggling with.
So I just want to close this part of the program, and then I'm going to let you guys ask questions. There's a great sentence in the book that Norm says, all planners should be possibilists. Possibilists. And I think it's kind of what you're saying, Pat. So do you want to just, in closing?
Yeah, sure. We all think in terms of optimists and pessimists. And most of our thoughts go along those two lines. What I'm trying to suggest in that remark in one of the chapters in the book is that instead of being an optimist or a pessimist, that planners should be possibilists. Now, I know there's no such word. But,
there is now.
But there should be. And what it means is that under the right set of circumstances, the stars align and the strangest things that you thought would never take place, take place. And we may not have a rational explanation for why that is, but that's what happens. And in the book I cite, on the international level, the removal of the Soviet Union from the world's power stage, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, the removal of the Red Army from Germany without a war. I cite the conversion of South Africa from a racist apartheid society to one where majorities of African American peoples are recognized as the majority and the controlling majority, and the whites accept that, and apartheid disappears. The marriage possibilities of male and female individuals who adopt or is interested in or biologically suited for another sex. Prior to the Supreme Court ruling a couple of years ago, the possibility of marriage among those people simply did not exist. All of a sudden, a case comes up, the Supreme Court makes a ruling, and it's possible for homosexuals and lesbians and others, trans people, to enjoy a normal wedding and enjoy a married life. And we can go on and on and on. In my experience and in your experience, you can think of areas where something happened that you thought was never going to happen and was impossible. Well, what I'd like to suggest is that we all think of those issues as being possible, and that we work toward a situation as implausible as it seems to make those situations possible. And if we're all possibilists, maybe in some future, which will be better than the current future, we'll be able to enjoy more and more of these issues which vex our society as they come into focus and into solution. Because now, for some reason, inexplicable as it might be, the stars have aligned, the politics have lined up, and what was impossible yesterday is now possible and doable.
Okay. Okay, questions. I think we would like you to come up to the microphone because this is being recorded, and that way we'll have your question recorded. Does anyone have questions? just come on up and we'll make a line and you can ask.
All right. All right, thank you. I have a question for Tanya. So you talked about the Glenville neighborhood 105 revitalization, and I was wondering, how will that affect some of the, just like, what is the future of some of these side streets, especially near Lakeview and 123rd, which have high numbers of vacant houses and very little rehabilitation at all, if any, in the past 20, 25 years? Will there be any houses remaining on these streets in 20 years from now? And also, with some of the newer houses that were built in 2004, 2005, maybe even in the 90s, we've seen them going vacant recently and burning down, especially on 125th. What is some of the ideas they have for that part of town in Ward 9? Thanks.
And I wish I had easy answers for that. I don't. I mean, I think that, you know, the intent was to start as proximate as we could to University Circle in terms of you make, you know, a significant investment in a small area, and then you start to see that ripple effect where, you know, 5 years ago, housing on Ashby, nobody wanted to build new housing, and now there's housing that's being sold at market rate. We know that, I mean, in the city of Cleveland, so in any case, that the idea of the Mayor's Transformation Initiative is to focus on those nodes and grow from there. Where you're talking about is considerably farther north, and we know that really the devastation for our community, as there has been sprawl with the foreclosure crisis, that there is a lot of management that still has to happen from a demolition perspective. The hope now that there is more dollars that would be going into rehabilitation of property is something that we'd be looking at. And then, you know, holding parcels, because I will say that one of the really important things with our land bank is getting parcels out into the community where people can build infill homes. You know, we have economic development projects like Opportunity Corridor that only could have happened because we're assembling land sites. But some of those areas that today seem so challenged, if we hold that land, part of it is that we help to control the market because we're not flooding the market with land. But then there is potential that that area could be redeveloped at another point. I think we always have to look back at, you know, some of our near West Side neighborhoods that, you know, it's difficult to afford to live there. 40 years ago, people were, you know, like turn the lights out when the last person moves out. So I think we have to plan for that successful future, but I don't have good answers for today.
I just want to say many of those houses are pretty beautiful doubles, especially on Durant and Osceola.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
I have a question for any of the folks up here who would take it. I want to know about opportunity zones and if you all are possibilists about their potential impact on equity in Cleveland, and if so, what sort of strategies do you think it would take to make that happen?
You want to start, Mark?
Thanks a lot, Liz. You know, here's the paradigm, I think, which is that opportunity zones were not set up to be super useful tools targeted to the benefit of low-income communities and mixed-income communities, right? I mean, they're really set up as a Wild West arrangement for all kinds of people to just make money and to defer taxes and make money. So the question is, you know, and a lot of communities are looking at this, right? I actually think in Cleveland, things have been done, I don't know so much throughout the county, but things have been, the zones have been picked pretty well. I mean, of course, you're going to pick downtown because that you know, you're going to have money going in there. But, you know, the West 25th Street corridor going south and then out towards the Opportunity Corridor, and including neighborhoods where, you know, we got a good amount of public housing, but the opportunity to invest. The question is whether we can bring investors in coupled with public dollars in a way that, and other bank dollars, in a way where you can actually kind of marry all those three together. And I think that's unproven yet. I I think we have some good leadership from the Fund for Economic Future, some good leadership from the City Economic Development Department, and GCP, but it honestly remains to be seen. I mean, it doesn't even need to be, we're not even going to know what kind of investments got made in this community, because you don't have to report it, right? I mean, you report it on your taxes, that's it. There's no coming back with it. So part of it is just trying to create a different culture with the tool that wasn't made to work this way. I think there's possibility though.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's possibility. I don't discount anything you just said, but I think this is a place where our community is really working very well together. The Fund for Economic Future, Director Ebersol and GCP have really done, I think, a yeoman's task of putting together a perspective that really sells the city of Cleveland, and now is looking at an equity framework for how we attract investors, how those investments look. And we are seeing, in that terms of whatever it may be, it's bringing money into the community and having people look at areas of the city that maybe they wouldn't have before. Clearly, there's some of the regular suspects, or usual suspects, but I do think, PNC has been very active in amassing a fund. A few of the other banks are really, I think it was Key, are quickly catching up, and I think we're actively going to be looking at investors from outside of the region and pairing that with the work that's happening along Opportunity Corridor to look at, right now it's very much a real estate play, but what would really be the win is if it brings businesses and helps businesses expand and then create jobs. So I think it's a very, very odd tool, but I think that Cleveland is doing the right things to position ourselves for investments. Again, sometimes we're not even going to know that they're coming in, but the ones where they're coming to the city for support. Right. And I will say one other thing, we're really starting to get more involved in my department now in this project because of the fact that the projects that normally don't get looked at, right, where we need to rehab affordable housing, specifically in the Glenville area. We know there's some really significant projects that need to be rehabbed. That wouldn't normally attract Opportunity Zone funding, but if we can bring that to people's attention and they just need to do something with their capital gains tax, maybe they'll invest. So.
Any other questions?
Good afternoon. First of all, what a fantastic panel. Really, this is just thrilling. It's been really a wonderful, riveting conversation. So thank you. But Norm, I have two questions for you. One is, when you think about Cleveland, what are the areas, and by that I don't mean necessarily geography, what are the areas where you see the most possibility as a possibilitist? Well, help me pronounce the word. And then secondly, looking back on your amazing career, is there anything you would have done differently?
Thanks very much, Kate. With regard to the first question, the possibilities for Cleveland in the future must lie with the existing population and also with the new people who are coming into town. We are not a powerful in-migration community, that is to say, like Seattle or Washington, D.C. or Manhattan or places like that, where cities are being flooded with new people with college degrees and good jobs and so on, but we're catching up. And so I think there's a lot of possibilities with our existing population and also with the new people who are in-migrating with training, ability, and imagination, and a new set of values. So I think there's a lot of possibility there. So with regard to the second question, what is it over a period of 50-odd years that I would have done differently? Not much. I must say, as I've told any number of people, that I've been incredibly fortunate in my career. I had a nice few years, 5 years in Pittsburgh working for the planning department before I came here to work for Carl Stokes. And I thought the possibility of working for Carl Stokes was just fabulous. There were a lot of things I thought of doing in Pittsburgh which I could not do for a variety of mostly political reasons. And I thought the opportunity to work for an African-American mayor would be an interesting way to go. I'd never worked for a black man before. I'd never been in a work environment where there were black people at leadership positions, and I found that true for the first time in the Stokes administration. And it was a very, very refreshing kind of thing. And there were things that we could do that were just mind-boggling, I believe. One of the things we did, for example, in the first couple of years was build a couple of thousand, no kidding, low-income public housing units. Now, you don't do that in an ordinary kind of circumstance because there are all kinds of provisos in state law, mostly, that allow communities to opt out, and there are barriers that individual politicians put into the process at the local level that are impossible or difficult to overcome. We overcame everything, and we did what had to be done. And so that was an opportunity not only to begin working in an entirely different racial environment, but an opportunity to learn from that environment and an opportunity to go off and then work for two other mayors in the 70s who could not have been more different. So you had this bizarre kind of a situation over a 10-year period where you had an African-American liberal mayor who was a beautiful speaker with liberal ideas, followed immediately by a white ethnic conservative Republican mayor with conservative ideas, and then followed by Dennis Kucinich, who was at that time styling himself as a urban populist. And you couldn't imagine three mayors who were more difficult. Yet what I learned in the Stokes administration, I learned to carry through with all those administrations that facilitated whatever my staff and I were trying to do. So I regard that as a particularly fortunate experience. I regard that as a tremendous learning experience, and off the top of my head, I can't think of anything I would have chosen to do differently. But thanks for the question.
Okay, we'll take two more questions.
Good afternoon. Professor Krumholtz, to your point just a moment ago about the amount of low-income housing that you conducted during your Stokes administration period, the question for that is, are we at a point where we're seeing that again where the housing stock is at that point where we actually need that type of investment in housing development? And then to the rest of the panel, we talk a lot about affordable housing. Are we referring to it from a market-driven standpoint where it's the developer's choice as to what affordable housing is or what the market dictates it is? Or are we talking about the actual people that would buy the house, the people who live in Cleveland on a per capita income of around $27,000? So who is actually the affordable housing person? Is it person or is it market?
Thank you.
I guess the affordable housing person, from my perspective, and other panelists may disagree, are the people who have the fewest choices. To fit in with the motto that my staff and I adopted early on in the decade, more choices for those who have few was the overarching objective. Not more choices, but more choices for those who have few. And if you think about it, those people in our society who have fewest choices, not only in housing, but in education and job opportunities and so on, are those people with the least resources. And so that's the top priority.
I guess I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think you do speak to a gap that we see that in Cleveland that is such a poor community in many ways. Affordable housing in a development really can be rents that are above what somebody who's making that $27,000 to $35,000 can afford. And so often the people who really need to most benefit from affordable housing are instead in the private market paying rents of $300, $400, $500 in substandard housing, where that affordable home that is subsidized by all of us in the work that we do, though that rent is more $700, $800, $900. And that's something that I think we really need to address. It's what you're saying, there's not enough vouchers that allow people to move into that housing, and so the people who do, again, they probably need, that person who's paying $100 of rent, probably that is what they can afford, but it's not really targeted or not meeting the needs then, and that's why we need so much more low-income housing in that really meets that need of someone who can pay $300 to $600 a month, which is really more, I think, in the area that you're speaking of. It's not to say that that price point of $800 is something we want to get away from. It's just, I think, not really meeting the need of that person.
And I
Jeff or
think too,
Pat,
it's one of those things where the answer to your question is probably yes and yes. In some circumstances, it will be developers that are going to say, within the context of what I'm doing, here is what I can perceive to be affordable. And it may not necessarily be affordable to everyone, but it will be more affordable to some than others in that area. But I think that there's a bigger, the distinction between low income and affordable housing is beginning to go away. And I think that it's important that when you look at affordable housing, that you are looking at the people who you are trying to serve and making sure that everyone in the community can afford to live somewhere, and that somewhere has quality, good, standard housing. And that's going to vary for different people. But at the end of the day, I don't want people to get so wrapped up in the specifics of it that we don't look at it and just say that there are areas in the city that people cannot live, and there's housing available in some of those areas. And we want to be able to make sure that people can have the opportunity to live in the city. We want to make sure that people have the opportunity to be able to have some level of quality housing, and working together, whether it be through vouchers, whether it be through tax credits, whether it be through other initiatives that may be led, but just finding a way to make sure that people who may not have everything do have the opportunity to be able to get a certain level of quality housing.
Okay. Did you want to comment? Well, this will be our last question.
You mentioned at the Bone Tower project specifically some of the things that you were able to do to get an emotional, a personal investment from the residents that helped contribute to its success. As we all look to sort of affect change at a city level, at a regional level, how, in your experiences, since you're all involved in different aspects, how have you been able to get that kind of emotional investment at these larger levels and not just at the project level? It's kind of...
Okay, well, I'll give it a shot. I think it starts in the identification of the people who are working as a part of the project. If you have people on your team who care about what they're doing, then it creates an environment that the people who they're working with want to believe that the people who are doing these things want something that's good for them. So I think it starts with communication. It starts with having a plan that people can see. When we talked about the word, and I don't want to mess it up, possibility, whatever it is, you want to be able to make sure that people can see that vision and believe that that vision can actually become some form of a reality, whether it be a full-fledged achieving that vision, but getting people to be able to buy into the fact that that vision is something that can actually happen. I mean, it's funny, someone was talking about, things that happened in the past and things that you could never believe happening. I remember being in high school the first time Jesse Jackson ran for president. And for a young African-American student at Lincoln West, we're sitting up there, hearing that Jesse's running. I mean, we couldn't he would run, let alone win. We were just happy that Jesse was running and he was involved in the process, and we were able to see someone on television at that national level, at that national stage, be engaged in the process. I never thought in my wildest dreams that there would be a Barack Obama, that Barack Obama would actually occur and actually be real and actually be able to complete 2 terms and be someone that you could sit back and say, wow, over the terms that individual was there, you didn't hear a lot of stuff. Whether you liked him or you didn't like him, you didn't hear a lot of stuff. And I look at that and saying that you have to create those visions, that even if you don't believe that some of those things are possible, even if you don't believe that it could happen today, as time goes on and as people change, maybe some of the things that couldn't happen today could happen down the line. And I'm sure that, when you listen to Norman, he talks about some of the things that happened, back in the 70s or could not happen back in the 70s. They still may not be happening full-fledged in 2019, but it is a bigger step, a bigger jump than it was then. So I think having that vision, believing in that vision, and having people who are willing to sacrifice and want to contribute to that vision, I think is key to moving it ahead.
And I guess I would say I think that's a real strength in Cleveland. There's work that's happening in our neighborhoods that's really been led initially by teams from Neighborhood Connections. Indigo Bishop, I think you're doing this today with the Woodhill Choice work, where it's real authentic engagement with residents that doesn't just tie to a project, but that goes on throughout and really empowers residents to take leadership in their own neighborhoods, to be part of the process, to really start from an asset-based model, not just to be looking at all the things that are wrong in their neighborhoods, all the problems, but to see that there's strength in their communities and their neighbors and the people that they work with every day, and that strength and that community is really what allows for the big things to happen later, that they're the ones who are building their communities. It's not the city of Cleveland or Enterprise or CMHA or anybody else. It's really their ability long-term to sustain the change that they want to see. And I think that we have seen that in neighborhoods in really small ways that are most important, where you have residents, instead of calling the police, feeling like they know each other well enough when the music is loud to go, knock on somebody's door and explain that, hey, I have a small child, right? Like those kind of smaller wins then I think lead to that building enough trust in a community to affect, significant change in the way that you're talking about. And I think Cleveland's been really good at that.
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
And does anyone else have any closing thoughts? Pat, and then Mark, do you?
Yep, I'm good. That was mine.
Okay.
So I'm going to withdraw my last question because it was so well asked by so many of you, including you, Kathy, in the discussion about possibilities. I'll just say it that way. But I have a last observation, and that is, so many of us read that Lawrence Ferlinghetti turned 100 last year, and there were a lot of commentaries about that, and great commentaries that he was the voice of San Francisco, that he had the conscience of San Francisco, occasional gadfly of San Francisco, and then the kind of wrap-up comment was that he was the civic furniture of San Francisco. And I thought, okay, I know somebody like that. And I think somebody that I know is having a birthday soon. I don't know that you're going to be 100, Norm, but I believe you have a birthday soon. And I think of it, all those things that were said about Lawrence Ferlinghetti, I think about you. I think most of us in this room say the same thing. You've been the voice, you've been the conscience, you've been the gadfly. But you've really built, and I hope you appreciate this, you've built a civic infrastructure with all of the human capacity in this city, as well as the infrastructure that we think about, like furniture and houses. And I just, I want you to know that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much. Believe me, from the bottom of my heart, it has been a pleasure.
And on that note, I would thank you all for coming and conclude our forum, and books are for sale over there. So thank you.